Hello, today I'll be historically speaking on Judith Sargent Murray's work on the equality of the sexes. On the equality of the sexes, like a lot of works we've read in this class this year, focuses on inequalities in societies. Judith Sargent Murray was born into a wealthy family, yet she still faced many inequalities that stemmed from being a woman. It's important to note, before we go any further into reviewing what this text means for this time period, that Judith Sargent Murray was born to a wealthy family. Even though she didn't get a lot of opportunities that men did, she got more opportunities than women who were poor or women of color would have gotten. This means that this text only covers a certain part of history and only covers the experience of a couple of people. It doesn't cover all of history, so it may not be completely historically accurate. Judith Sargent Murray was born to a wealthy family that educated their sons very well and held education in high esteem. Even though she wasn't allowed to go to school and get an education, she was able to educate herself using her family's large library. Written in 1770 and finally published in 1779, On the Equality of the Sexes reflects many cultural and societal norms of this time period. It especially focuses on the role of housewives, which Judith Sargent Murray was, even though she didn't actually have children. During this time, women were thought of as inferior to men in many different ways, especially intellectually. They weren't allowed to get an education, and they were meant to be housewives. They were meant to have a family and get married young. They weren't supposed to have their own careers or their own jobs, and they really weren't supposed to be educated. They were taught to do house chores, and that was thought of as their education. Judith Sargent Murray didn't believe that women were naturally inferior to men, especially intellectually. Instead, she thought that society was set up to make them inferior. This shows that there really wasn't any education, and that's why she thought they were inferior. She was taught that women weren't allowed to get an education, and she thought that this made them intellectually inferior. If men were able to grow intellectually and women were not, then there would be a drastic gap. Men were scared of what would happen if women were considered equal at this time period. They thought that women would make bad housewives if they were able to get an education, and they were scared that they would later want jobs. Murray wrote that women could still be subservient to men, even if they did get an education. She actually spoke about them becoming better housewives and better women if they were able to get an education because they would be happier and they would find better husbands. It's important to note that if a woman is speaking about she should still be subservient, it really shows a lot about how drastic this inferiority complex was at this time. In modern days, you would hear very little women say this, and it shows how far we've progressed from that point. There was also a heavy presence of religion in homes at this time. A lot of the inequality stemmed from different interpretations of religion, and Murray used this to her advantage in her writing. She wrote a lot about God, and she spoke about He gave both men and women infinite souls, and that she almost seems to say that if women aren't educated and they aren't smart and they're that inferior to men intellectually, they shouldn't be able to claim that they came from God, and that God would never create such an inferior species, that He would want everyone equal, that He would want His creations to be smart and to be impressive. And thus, if women wanted to be able to claim that they came from God and they were God's creations, they should get an education. She appealed to a lot of Protestant religious beliefs in her writing, which made her very popular at this time. This work really shows how different the women's rights movements were at this time. Today we're talking about wage inequality, we're talking about pay gaps, and even a little later after this was written, in the late 1800s, they're talking about getting women the right to vote. They're talking about really getting women into careers and making them strong and making them really have a place in society. Here, we're talking about letting women get educated, teaching them to read instead of just teaching them to clean, and maybe letting them go to college and just improve the situation a little bit. And that really shows how different this time period was to ours now. It's also really important to note that later on, women's rights group would completely move away from Murray's perspective. This work was very popular because it was very early on in the women's rights movement, but her later works really didn't get any recognition because she really talked about women could still be subservient and they could still be housewives, that they didn't have to have jobs, and that they could still really be honestly kind of inferior to men, just not intellectually. It didn't appeal to a lot of later feminists because it really wasn't radical enough and it still gave women a place of inferiority in households.